Hi, this is Rick with Rage Against the Debt. In the previous segment of Rage Against the Debt, we looked at two of the main concerns with relying solely on economic growth to resolve our growing national debt crisis. In this segment, we'll look at the historic relationship between economic growth and our national debt in order to better understand why we need to do more than just grow the economy to resolve our national debt crisis. Welcome back to the revolution.
In 1950, the estimated population of the U.S. was about 150 million. It took until 2007, or 57 years, to double to 300 million. In 1950, the U.S. GDP was about $300 billion. U.S. GDP doubled to $600 billion by 1962, taking only 12 years. So GDP was growing nearly 5 times faster than the population, which is how standards of living are increased. In 1950, the national debt was $260 billion. It took nearly 25 years for the debt to double from that 1950 level. So the national debt was growing at half the rate of GDP. So was it mainly the growth in GDP that kept the debt flat? Well, let's compare data from the periods 1950 to 1981, when the debt remained relatively flat, versus 1982 to 2015, when the debt skyrocketed. We'll first look at actual GDP growth. GDP from 1950 to 1981 averaged annual growth of 8.1% versus just 5.2% for the period 1982 to 2015. But those who remember the 60s and 70s also know that inflation was at unusually high levels back then. When we adjust for inflation, the period 1950 to 1981 still had higher GDP growth, but only about a percentage point higher. Now let's look at the growth in the debt. From 1950 to 1981, the debt grew at an average rate of 4.5% per year, while from 1982 to 2015, the debt grew at an average rate of 9% per year. But again, we also need to adjust for inflation. Adjusted for inflation, the debt actually grew at less than 0.5% per year from 1950 to 1981, while from 1982 to 2015, the debt grew at an average yearly rate of over 6% after inflation. Now let's look at the deficits during this time. If we look at each year's change in debt as a percent of GDP, we have a good proxy for each year's gross budget deficit or surplus. Note that from 1950 to 1974, the deficit never exceeded much over 2% of GDP. Now recall that real inflation was over 4% at this time, which means that the debt was growing at a slower pace than inflation. So in real terms, or in other words, after adjusting for inflation, the debt was actually flat to slightly declining from 1950 to 1974. Except for the space of a few years in the late 1990s, that's not the case after 1974, and especially not the case after 1982. Notice the sharp upward trajectory in debt after 1982. And if we look at government revenue or taxes and government outlays or expenditures as a percent of GDP, we see that what has drastically changed is the spend part of the equation. Prior to 1982, and especially prior to 1974, the government did a much better job of managing the budget and controlling expenses. This graph is an example of what we would expect to see if the theory is true that years with higher growth of GDP result in reductions in federal debt. The two lines representing growth in GDP and growth in debt should diverge on a graph. In other words, higher growth in GDP should result in declines in the growth of debt. And conversely, when growth in GDP declines, the growth in debt should increase. Let's look at a graph of the actual data for growth in GDP versus growth in the debt. We see many years where higher growth in GDP was accompanied by higher growth in debt. We also see years where a drop in GDP corresponds to lower growth in debt. A simple regression analysis, which shows statistical correlation, confirms what we see visually. There is no correlation between growth in GDP and the growth in debt. History shows that higher growth in GDP has not led to reducing the national debt.
Increasing economic growth would increase tax revenue, reduce deficits, and limit growth in the national debt. If the economy grows fast enough, it may even result in budget surpluses and reductions in the national debt. It's pretty simple and straightforward, right? That was essentially the premise of several past administrations. Cut taxes to increase economic activity, which would then raise the economic tide for all our ships, including the federal government's tax revenue. The arguments for and against this type of economic plan are many and are complex. There is no consensus of opinion on whether this type of policy will work. But there is clear evidence from history that we should not count on increased growth in GDP alone to get us out of debt.